Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samach Daled, Daf 64 of Masechta Pesachim. At the beginning of the Daf, we just kind of wrap up the previous Daf, the previous kind of Mishnah about shechting the korban pesach when there's chametz around, and then we move on to this extremely interesting Mishnah that discusses what exactly was going on when the korban pesach was offered in the Beis Hamikdash, which is, I think, pretty interesting stuff. So let's get started over here on Daf Samach Daled Amud Aleph, about 8-9 lines into the page. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af HaTamid. So Rabbi Yehuda says even the Tamid. So our Mishnah had said that if you shech the korban pesach and you still have chametz around, so it's a problem because l'sishchat al chametz tam zivchi. Don't shech the korban pesach when there's still chametz around. So now it says Rabbi Yehuda that it even applies to the korban tamid as well. That if the korban tamid shabbeinu abayim is slaughtered and whoever's, I assume means whoever's slaughtering it has chametz around, so then you're going to be violating this lav of the sishchat al chametz tam zivchi. Okay, so now says the Gemara, my time with Rabbi Yehuda, how come Rabbi Yehuda says that the sishchat al chametz tam zivchi applies also to the korban tamid shabbeinu abayim? Because amalach zivchi zevach miyuchad liyumaniu tamid. So says Rabbi Yehuda, because the pasuk says lo sishchat al chametz tam zivchi, my offering, my zevach, so my sacrifice. So what's zivchi? What's my sacrifice? Well, the sacrifice that is miyuchadli, that is special for me. And what is that? The tamid that is offered twice daily. So even the korban tamid is relevant in the context of the sishchat al chametz tam zivchi. And if you shech the korban tamid when you have chametz around, you'll be violating this lav, and we'll whip you with a warning first. Reb Shimon Omer, says Reb Shimon, HaPesach ba'ba also v'chulei. So Reb Shimon had this interesting opinion, which is that on the 14th day of Nisan, so the only korban that is shaykh to lo sishchat al chametz tam zivchi is the korban pesach, no other korban. However, during the rest of Pesach, all of the other korbanis are shaykh to lo sishchat al chametz tam zivchi, that if you have chametz around, when you slaughter them, you will be violating this lav. Now, of course, it does not apply on Pesach to the korban pesach, because the korban pesach can only be offered on Erev Pesach. So now, my time with Reb Shimon, how come Reb Shimon has this opinion? So, zivchi trei zimnei. Well, because interestingly, actually we have two psukim that say lo sishchat al chametz tam zivchi. Mamish. It says the same exact thing. Oh no, it doesn't. One pasuk says lo sizbach al chametz tam zivchi. The other one says lo sishchat al chametz tam zivchi. But it's the same idea, and it says zivchi in both psukim. So it says zivchi twice. So karibei zevach zvachai. So if you chop one of the yuds from one of the zivchis and apply it to the other one, so what you're left with is the word zevach in one place, and the word zvachai, my offerings, in the other one, right? Zvachai, plural. So therefore, the limud is that zvachai means it's not just limited to the korban pesach, it's limited to all korbanos. That any korban, if you slaughter it on pesach, when you still have chametz around, you will be violating this mitzvah lo saseh of lo sishchat al chametz tam zivchi. So now lamay hilchos palginu rachmana me'adadi v'lo kasav zvachai. Well, if that's the case, then how come the Torah didn't just write zvachai explicitly? How come it said zivchi in two places? Now you have to take the yud from one and join it and add it to the other one. Why not just write zvachai explicitly? So my answer is to make the drasha of lemeimer bisman deika zevach lo mechayev zvachai bisman deleka zevach mechayev zvachai. So the limud is the reason why the Torah left the work of taking the yud from one place and adding it to the other one is to teach us that it's not, across the board. It's not always like this. Rather, what it means that on the 14th day of Nisan, when there is a zevach, when there is a korban pesach to be offered, so the korban pesach is going to be the only korban that has this lav associated with it, that if you shech the korban pesach and you still have chametz around, you will be violating lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. However, the rest of Pesach, when there is no korban pesach, that is when we say that any of the other korbanos, if you slaughter them when there's still chametz around, you will be violating the lav of lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Very interesting. Uvemoed l'shmo pater v'chulei. Then, so Reb Shimon continued in the Mishnah and he said that on Pesach, so during Chol HaMoed, if you slaughter the korban pesach on Chol HaMoed, which is obviously it's not its proper time, or maybe even just even the first day of Pesach, whenever it is, any day of Pesach, if you slaughter the korban pesach l'shmo with the intention of a korban pesach, which of course is improper because the korban pesach is only offered on the 14th, well, in that case, you will be pater from violating lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi, because it says lo sishchat, don't slaughter the korban pesach when there's chametz around. But if you slaughter a korban pesach, l'shem korban pesach, on Pesach when it's not the proper time for korban pesach, so then it's not considered shchita and you're not going to be chayiv. Says the Gemara, time of the shelo l'shmo. So the Mishnah says that according to Reb Shimon, if you shech the korban pesach, no. Well, yes, if you shech the korban pesach on Pesach, shelo l'shmo, i.e., with the intention of a shlamim, so then you will be violating the lav of lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi, right? Because we say that on Pesach, right, zvachai, that you may not offer any offering on Pesach when there's chametz around. Fine. Now, time of the shelo l'shmo. Now, says the Gemara, the reason why you're going to be chayav is because you're specifically having the intention that you're slaughtering this korban pesach l'shem shlamim, and therefore you're going to be chayav for the shchita of lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Hastama pater. The implication being, but what if you didn't explicitly have the intention of shlamim? Just you had a korban which was initially set aside as your korban pesach. It's now on Pesach. You shecht it. It sounds like you would be pater. Amai Pesach b'shai mosashana shlam mave. But why should it be pater? A korban pesach, as we know by now, any other day of the year becomes just a regular korban shlamim. And if it's a regular korban shlamim, so then shouldn't the default shchita, when you don't have any specific explicit intention, be a shlamim? Shmas mina pesach b'shai mosashana b'yakira. Does that imply that a korban pesach on all the other days of the year still by default maintains its status as a korban pesach, and you'd have to explicitly have the intention of a shlamim in order for it to be considered shchita for a shlamim? And therefore, in this case, when you shech the korban pesach on Pesach, and you don't have explicit intention for a shlamim, so by default your intention is korban pesach and you'll be pater. So Reb Chiya bar Gamda nizika mipi chabura ve'amru, says Reb Chiya bar Gamda that the chabura, I don't know, some group that they were in, unanimously explained, kigon shayu bailim tmei emes. No, this Mishnah is specifically talking about where the owners of the korban pesach were tmei emes, and that is why they did not offer it on Erev Pesach. V'nidchin the Pesach Sheni, and they therefore got pushed off to Pesach Sheni. A month later, they were going to offer their korban pesach, the stamid from Pesach Koi, and then they ended up shechting it on Pesach itself. So, because this animal was intended to be offered as a Pesach Sheni in a month from now, that is why it maintains its default status as a korban pesach. However, regular korban pesach that for whatever reason was not offered on the 14th day of Nisan, well then, on Pesach itself, it would just become a korban shlamim, and the default would be a shlamim, and therefore, if you had chametz around, you would be chayev for lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Wow, very interesting. Okay, so now we get to this new Mishnah, which describes everything that was going on describes what was going on in the Beis Hamikdash while the korban pesach was being slaughtered. I think it's pretty interesting. Ha-pesach nishchat b'shalosh kitos. So the korban pesach was slaughtered in 3 groups. Okay, so you'd have all the people, all the Yidden in Jerusalem, and there would be 3 groups, 3 shifts for slaughtering the korban pesach. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, v'shachtu also kol kahal adas Yisrael, kol ve'edav Yisrael. So it says that they will slaughter it kol kahal adas Yisrael, the congregation of, the group of Israel. So we want to say kahal adas and Yisrael. There are 3 separate groups of 10 people per group at least. Now I know that Ada is definitely 10. I think we saw that already in Masechta Brachos, right? The pasuk says by the Meraglim ad Mosa la Ada Aroa Azos, and Yoshua and Kalev had already left, so there were 10 people left. Okay, so 3 groups, 10 each. The Gemara is going to explain what exactly that means. Nichnasa kasa rishona. Alright. Nichnasa kasa rishona. If so the first group goes in to the Azara. Nismala Azara Nalu Dalsos Azara. So the first group goes into the Azara, and then once the Azara becomes full, so they would lock the doors of the Azara, and we're going to see in the Gemara exactly how this happened. Taku Eriu v'taku, and then once everybody was inside of the Azara, they blew the shofar. HaKohanim omdim shuris, the Kohanim would stand in rows, uvidem baziche kesef baziche zav, and in their hands were these like receptacles of gold and silver. Shur shekula kesef v'shur shekula zav lo hayu me'oravin. And each row would be either entirely of gold utensils or entirely of silver utensils. They wouldn't be a combination. You'd have one row of Kohanim with silver utensils, one row of Kohanim with gold utensils, and there were a number of rows. Now these utensils, these receptacles that they would use for receiving the blood from the neck of the korban pesach, they didn't have a flat bottom that you can put it down, because if you could put it down, then the blood that is inside of it can congeal, and then you can't throw it on the mizbeach. So therefore, the receptacles did not have a flat bottom. That way you would never put it down, and you would keep it moving. Shachat Yisrael, so if Yisrael, because as we're going to see in the Gemara, and as we probably know already, that shchita of a korban does not have to be done by a Kohen, it can be done by a Zar, it can be done by anybody. So Shachat Yisrael, so if the Yisrael, if a non-Kohen slaughtered the korban pesach, v'kibel a Kohen, then from Mikabala ve'elach mitzvahs kahuna, right? So then the Kohen takes his receptacle, sticks it under the neck of the animal, and receives the blood. Nosno lachavero, v'chavero lachavero, and then they had an assembly line. So the Kohen who received the blood from the neck of the korban pesach then handed the receptacle on to the Kohen who is next to him, v'chavero lachavero, and then that Kohen would pass it to the Kohen next to him, and they would keep on passing from one to the other until, right, Mekabelas Hamoleu Machzer Sarekon Kohen Akar Veit Samazbeach Zorkos Rika Achas Kneged Esod. And basically, they would pass the blood from one Kohen to the other, and as you were passing a full receptacle, you would receive an empty one, so that they could keep on recycling the receptacles. And this would go until the blood reached the Kohen closest to the Mizbeach, and that Kohen would then chuck the blood on the Mizbeach, and then once again send back the empty receptacle. Once the first group was complete, was finished, so then the second group started. And then when the second group was done, the third one was admitted. And the same process that they employed for the first group, they also used with the second group and the third group. While all of this was going on, they were reciting Hallel. Im gamru shanu, vim shanu shilshu. And if they finished Hallel, they would read it a second time. If they finished it a second time, they would read it a third time. But it actually never got around to a third time of Hallel. Interesting. They were always finished with the group, with the shift, by the time the second one was over. By the time the second Hallel was complete. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda Mimeim shel kashlishis lo higiu lahavti ki yishma Hashem mipnei she'ama mu'atin. Says Rabbi Yehuda that by the third group, it never happened that by the third group they even got past the paragraph in Hallel of Ahavti ki yishma Hashem, because the third group was always the smallest group, and it wouldn't take that long to do. So in the same way, the same process that was employed during the week was employed on Shabbos. The only difference between the weekdays and Shabbos is that on Shabbos, the Kohanim would wash the floors of the Azara, and the Chacham were not so happy with that. And we're going to see in the Gemara who these Chachamim more. But basically the way it works is that there was like a stream that would go through the Azara, and this stream would be able to pass out all of the blood and all the other stuff that's going on with all the korbanos in the Azara. Now to wash the Azara, they would plug up this stream so that the water would overflow and then wash out all the blood and stuff. Now, if they would do that, so they would do that on Shabbos as well, but apparently not everybody was so thrilled that they were washing the floors on Shabbos. Okay, the Gemara is going to discuss it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda kosei memale midam hata'aroves. Interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says that you would take a cup and you would fill it up with all the blood from the korbanos, right? Because as we're going to see, there was a lot of blood darting. So Rabbi Yehuda says they would take a cup and they would just stick it down on the floor and just fill up the cup with whatever mixture of blood from all the different korbanos. And he would chuck this blood onto the mizbeach, right? So that if any blood from any particular korban, fell on the floor and got lost, well, he'll fill up this cup from all of the blood in the Azara and throw that in the mizbeach. So memele, every korban will be represented in that cup. But the Chacham disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda. Okay? Great. So now the korban pesach is slaughtered. So how would you hang it up so that you can remove the skin? Unkalios shel barzel hayu kvuin b'ksalim uva'amudin. Well, not just remove the skin, but also remove the intestines. Maybe even cut it up and stuff. But I'm not sure about that. So unkalios shel barzel hayu kvuin b'ksalim. So there were hooks of iron that were stuck in the walls of the Azara, uva'amudim sheboin tolin uva'amudim, and also in the pillars that were in the butchery area of the Azara. Sheboin tolin umafshitin, and on these hooks they would hang the korban pesach and they would flay it. Kol mi sheyesh lo makom lislos ulahavshit. I'm sorry. Kol mi she'ein lo makom lislos ulahavshit. Now, if all of the hooks were claimed, and you have your korban pesach and you have to flay it, but there's no hooks available, maklos dakim v'chalakom hayusham. So there were these thin and smooth staffs in the Azara. Maniach al ksefo al kosef chavero. And you would take this staff and you would put one end on your shoulder, one end on your friend's shoulder, v'tole umafshit, and then you would hang the korban pesach from this staff, from this pole, and then slit it open, remove the skin, all the fun stuff. Rabbi Eliezer Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer Yudalid shechalios b'Shabbos. If the 14th day of Nisan was a Shabbos, maniach yodo al kosef chavero v'yad chavero al ksefo v'sole umafshit. So if it's Shabbos and these staffs, these poles are muktzeh, so instead use your own poles. Take your arm, stick it on your friend's shoulder, have your friend stick his arm on your shoulder, close your eyes, take a dead sheep, hang it from your arms, and then start, taking knives and cutting it open, removing skin and intestines and guts. So yeah, just probably close your eyes. And then you open them and you're all full of blood and guts and all that kind of stuff. Alright. Karu v'otziu es murav, so they tore it open and they removed its intestines. Nisanan b'magis, and they put the intestines on some kind of a plate. V'iktirin al gabe mizbeach, then they would bring it over to the mizbeach and burn the intestines. And that was awesome. Yatzus hakasa rishona v'yashva l'harabayis, and then if it was Shabbos, so then the first group would leave the Azara and go out to like the temple courtyard. V'yashva l'harabayis fan shnia b'chel, so the second group would leave the Azara and they would sit in like surrounding the Azara and the Ezras Nashim was this like 10 amma by 10 amma, I don't know, like area called the Chel. So the second group would hang out in the Chel. Vashlishis b'mkoma umedes, and the third group would just stay where they were. It sounds like in the Azara. Chashecha yatsu v'tzalu as Pesachim, and then when Shabbos was over, they would then go home and roast their korban pesach. Very, very interesting. Alright, what do you guys think? Kind of interesting, right? How they would process the korban pesach in the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, in a pesach nishchat el begimel kitos shel shloshim bnei adam. So it says Rabbi Yitzchak that, so there were three groups, right? Says Rabbi Yitzchak, each group, each shift needs to have at least 30 people. How come? My timer. Call the aid of Yisrael. Well, because it says Kohal the aid of Yisrael, which is 10. We want to assume that it's 10 people each. Misapkolan, and we're not sure if it means one group of 30. If it means three groups of 10. So therefore, we just go to the extreme and we say, look, let's just have three groups and 30 people in each group. That if you need 30 people in one group, well, you have that. And if we need a total of 30 spread out among three shifts, well, we have that as well. And therefore, technically, all you really need is actually 50. Because you initially admit 30 people into the Azara, and they offer the korban pesach. And then you bring in another 10 people, and then 10 other people can leave. And this is now moving on to shift number 2, which also has 30 people. And then another 10 people join the Azara, and 10 people leave. So this now constitutes your third shift in the Azara. So really all you had is 50, right? 30 plus 10 plus 10, but that represents the three groups, and you still have 30 at all times. Alright, sounds good to me. Okay, so we said that the first group would enter into the Azara, and then they would lock the doors. So here's an interesting machlokas Abaye and Rava about how exactly the doors would be locked. Itma Abaye Omar says Abaye nin alu tnan. Abaye says nin alu, which is passive, that they were locked, i.e. as a miracle. There was a miracle. When the Azara filled up, when there was just the right amount of people, the doors of the Azara would lock themselves. Rava Amar, Rava says, no alintnan, that they would lock the doors of the Azara. My benayu, what's the nafkamina between Abaye and Rava? Ika the mismach hanisa. The question is, can you rely upon a miracle? Abaye Amar ninalutnan. Abaye says that the doors were locked on their own. They would just let as many people as can enter into the Azara, and the gates of the Azara knew whenever there was enough, and they would just close on their own. But nothing had to be monitored by the Kohanim or anything like that. Rava Amar no alintnan. Rava says that no, they would lock the gates of the Azara. We don't rely upon miracles. We would take a look at how many people are there, and when there was enough, they would close the doors. Now, that which we learned in a Mishnah, and it's quoted in Masechta Brachos and Daf Yud Tes. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Chas v'shalom she'akavya b'malala nisnada. Right, there was a havamina to say that maybe akavya b'malala got excommunicated. Says Rabbi Yehuda, Chas v'shalom, no way, no how, that akavya b'malala got excommunicated. Shein azara nin eles al kol adam b'Yisrael b'chachma v'yiraschet ka'akavya b'malala. Because when the doors of the Azara were locked on Erev Pesach, when everybody was shechting the korban Pesach, and there were lots of people over there, there was one person who stood out in wisdom and in fear of sin, and that was Akavya ben Malalo. So therefore, okay, awesome. Now, Abaye Mitar Tzatami, Rav Mitar Tzatami. Abaye explains that excerpt in line with his reasoning, and Rav explains it in line with his reasoning. Abaye Mitar Tzatami. Ein ba'azara b'shashin eles al kol adam b'Yisrael b'chachma v'yiraschet ka'akavya b'malala. So Abaye says, yeah, when the gates closed on their own, so then there was nobody as great as Akavya b'malala in the Azara. Rav Mitaritz the Taime in ba'azara b'shashinu alin osa al kol Yisrael b'chachma v'yiraschet ka'akavya b'malala. Whereas Rav says it means that when they would lock the gates themselves, so at that point the greatest person in there would be Akavya ben Malalo. Wow. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Me'olam lo nismoich adam ba'azare chutz mi pesach echad shoy b'mehilal. Wow. Shenismoich bo zaken echad vayukorin also pesach me'uchin. Let's read that again. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Me'olam lo nismoich adam ba'azare. Nobody ever got trampled in the Azar, right? It would be packed. All of Am Yisrael, as we're going to see in a few minutes, there could have been up to 12 million people there. And it was absolutely packed. The Azara is not a big place. And, or at least the parts that the non-Kohanim are able to get into, certainly. And yet nobody ever got trampled to death. Chutz mi pesach echad, shoy b'mehilal. Well, except for that one time, there was one Pesach during the days of Hillel, shenismayich bo zaken echad, that actually one elderly person got squashed. Also Pesach Me'uchin, and from then on they referred to that Pesach as the Pesach, the squashed Pesach, the Pesach where a fellow got squashed. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hamachas bikesh Agrippas Amelech litinena b'chusei Yisrael. One time Agrippas the king wanted to know how many Yidden were there, so he figured, you know what? On Erev Pesach, all of the Yidden are going to come to Yerushalayim to be Ola Regel, and they're going to offer their korban Pesach, so let's just count that. Omer the Kohen Gadol, so he said to the Kohen Gadol, Tenenecha b'Pesachim, count, keep an eye on the Pesachim, and let me know how many were offered. Notokuya mikol echad ve'echad, so he took one kidney from each korban Pesach, v'nimtzu sham shishim ribo zuge klayos. So the Kohen Gadol put aside one kidney from each korban Pesach, and there were 600,000 pairs of kidneys, i.e., 1.2 million kidneys. Kiflaim kiyotze Mitzrayim, twice as many as the people who left Mitzrayim. Chutz mi tameh v'shoyeh b'derech hachoka, and that doesn't take into account anybody who's tameh and therefore could not bring the korban Pesach, or anybody who was out of town and therefore could not offer the korban Pesach. Ve'ein chokol Pesach v'Pesach shlo nimnu olav yoser me'asar b'nei adam. And every korban Pesach has at least 10 people on it. Wait, one second. Did I understand? Pesach shlo nimnu olav yoser me'asar b'nei adam. There was no korban Pesach that has more than 10 people. What does that mean? I don't know. But it definitely means that we're assuming that there is 10 people for each one, I think. I think we just got into like double negative zone. But I think the point is that we're saying that there was 10 people for each korban Pesach. So, therefore, we had 1.2 million korban Pesachs. And we can assume that there were 10 people associated with each korban Pesach, which brings the tally up to 12 million korban Pesachs that year. That's like a whole bunch. Vayukorin also Pesach Me'uvin, and they called that Pesach, a very thick Pesach, i.e. there was a big turnout that year. Sounds like a big turnout to me. Now the Gemara says, what do you mean that they would take a kidney? You can't just take a kidney from Kodshim. You have to burn it on the Mizbeach. That belongs to the Eibishter. 1.2 million kidneys is not a small sum of emurin to chab. We say, yeah, don't worry. We then burnt the kidneys on the Mizbeach. But 1 second, it says Viktiro. You have to burn it, from which we learn that you can't have the fats of different korbanos get all mixed up together. And here, it sounds like lots of stuff got mixed up together. So the hadar maktilu chada chada. Yeah, but you would burn one, you would burn each one at a time. So it's not like they were all being like burned together. But the pasuk also says Viktiram, that you have to burn all of the emurin together. So meaning if you have a korban pesach and there's different parts of the korban pesach that go on the mizbeach for God, so all of those parts need to go on to the mizbeach at the same time. Not that you put everything on the mizbeach minus the kidney and then put the kidney separate. It all has to happen at once. So ela tfisa ba'alma deshaku minayu adiyavin le'midi achrina. No, so what it means is that they would take the kidney, lift it up, and then as they kind of did that, they would replace the kidney with some other thing, return the kidney to the rest of emurin, burn all the emurin on the mizbeach together, and then whatever they replaced the kidney with, like a bean or something like that, they would then just like count all the beans or whatever. Sounds fun? So the Mishnah continues, Kohanim omdim shuris v'chulei. So it says that the Kohanim would stand in these rows, and each row was either exclusively of silver or exclusively of gold, but they wouldn't be mixed together. My time, how come? Well, maybe you'll say, well, because it wouldn't be very nice if you have a Kohen who is giving to his friend like an empty gold receptacle, but then receiving a silver one that's full of blood, because it's or probably the opposite. Maybe he's receiving a silver one full of blood and he's giving away one that is gold, because gold is better than silver. So it's like he's trading in a higher quality thing for a lower quality thing. And we don't want to, right? Mailim b'kodesh, ein moridin. So achanami dil shakli by mason umayli by meya, but still, even if they're silver, one might be, let's say, worth 200 and the other one might be worth like 100. So therefore, still there's still like relative values even if they're all silver. So no, pashit, this was more beautiful to have rows of silver, rows of gold, not just like a whole mixture of all sorts of things. And these receptacles didn't have any flat bottoms so that you couldn't put it down. The rabbis taught all of these receptacles in the Beis Hamikdash did not have flat bottoms. The only exception being these bazichin for the levona that we discussed recently, that the frankincense that they would put on top of the lechem aponim. So those, we call them ladles of frankincense, they did have flat bottoms. Because we're concerned that, because if they have not flat bottoms so that you can't put them down, we have to rest them down for a week. And we're concerned that if you rest them down and they don't have a flat bottom, you might lean them against the bread and then the bread can kind of break. So because we don't want that to happen, we just give proper flat bottoms to the frankincense bazichin so that you can rest them down and they won't lean on the breads. Shachat Yisrael v'kibel akoyin v'chulei. So the Mishnah had said that a non-Kohen, a Yisrael, does the shchita, and then the Kohen receives the blood, does Kabbalah Sadam. Lo sagad elav Yisrael. So the Gemara says, what, does Yisrael have to do the shchita? What, a Kohen can't do the shchita? So Igufa Kamash Malon, the shchita b'zar kshera. The point is that we're saying that the shchita does not have to be done by the Kohen. It can even be done by the Yisrael, because shchita is permitted to be done by Yisrael. V'kibel HaKohen, and when it says that the Kohen receives the blood, HaKamash Malon Mikabala Ve'elach Mitzvahs Kehuna, that from receiving the blood and onwards is that the Kohen has to do that. At that point, from Mikabala Ve'elach, from starting with Kabbalah Sadam, all the rest of the activities need to be done by the Kohen. Nos no lachavero, and then the Kohen, after receiving the blood in the receptacle, hands it over to the Kohen who's standing next to him. Shmas mina holacha shelo beregel havya holacha. Aha. So the Gemara wants to say, what do we see from here? That, right, the holacha sadam, as we said, that there's 4 activities that happen with the blood, or with the korban, right? There's slaughtering it, then there's receiving the blood, walking the blood over to the Mizbeach, and then throwing the blood onto the Mizbeach. So let's say from here that from the fact that we're just taking the blood and passing it from one Kohen to the next. So let's say that holacha shelo beregel, that bringing the blood over to the Mizbeach, that you don't actually walk with, you're just standing there in one place and handing it to the next person, havya holacha, that could still count as walking it to the Mizbeach even though you're not actually moving. Dilmu hunayid porta. So the Gemara says, maybe it's not actually a good proof because maybe he's moving a tiny bit. Okay, so what's the chiddush of passing from one to the person to the next? What can we learn from it? Well, it teaches us that with a great turnout is the splendor of the king. I.e., we want to have lots of kohanim and have a whole process of rows of kohanim and lots of gold and silver and passing from one to the next to show that when there's a lot of people involved in the mitzvah, it's the glory, the splendor of the king. Okay, so the Kohen would receive a full receptacle and then pass on to his friend an empty receptacle. But don't do it the other way around. Don't first pass on the empty receptacle before receiving a full one. So Mesayele, the Reb Shimon ben Lakish, this supports Rish Lakish, the Amr Rish Lakish, the Reb Shimon ben Lakish, in Ma'avir al mitzvahs, we don't pass over mitzvahs. And therefore, if your friend is waiting to give you a receptacle full of blood that is en route to the Mizbeach, to do Zrikas Sadam, take that immediately. Don't first give him an empty one. No, first take the full receptacle of blood, which is a mitzvah, before passing the empty receptacle, because we don't pass over on mitzvahs. The Kohen who is close to the Mizbeach, so he throws the blood of the Mizbeach, of the korban pesach onto the Mizbeach. Mantana pesach bezrika. So who is the Tana who says that you throw the blood of the korban pesach onto the Mizbeach as opposed to pouring it onto the Mizbeach? Rav Chisda says that would be Rabbi Yossi Aglili. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, as domam tizrok al mizbeach v'eschelbam taktir, that in the context of a korban bechor, a firstborn animal that you offer, so it says as domam tizrok, that their blood you will throw on the mizbeach, v'eschelbam taktir, and its fats you will burn. Damo lo nemar ela damam, chelbo lo nemar ela chelbam. It doesn't say damo or chelbo, which is singular, and since it's only referring to the korban bechor, singular would be appropriate. But it says plural. It says damam. It says chelbam. What's the plural? What's it coming to include? Limit al bechor umaiser ufesach shein tu'un matan domin ve'emurin legabe mizbeach. So it teaches about not just the bechor, but also meiser behema and the korban pesach, where it doesn't explicitly say in the Torah anything about blood by the korban meiser and meiser behema and korban pesach, but we learn from the fact that it says damam and chelbam plural by bechor that even meiser and pesach also require stuff to happen with the blood, and we're going to say that it means that just like by bechor it says as damam tizrok, that you're going to throw the blood on the mizbeach as opposed to pouring it. So that we learn that also by meiser and by pesach we throw the blood on the mizbeach. Minalan de tu'unin yisod. So how do we know that you don't just throw the blood anywhere on the mizbeach, but specifically above the yisod? What's the yisod? So if you Google yisod on mizbeach, So you'll see at the very bottom of the Mizbeach, there was this, I think it was like 1 amma by 1 amma, I think. But this kind of cube thing that surrounds the very bottom of the Mizbeach. And it's not on every side of the Mizbeach. It's on the northern side, the western side, and then 1 amma on the eastern side, and 1 amma on the southern side. So basically the idea is that when you throw the blood in the Mizbeach, you have to throw it on a part of the Mizbeach that has Yesod Darton. Not part of the Mizbeach, not part of the walls of the Mizbeach that there's no Yesod at the bottom. Okay? So, Minol Detun and Yesod, how do we know that where you throw the blood, it has to be on a part of the wall that has Yesod at the bottom? Amr Belazar, As Zrika me Ola. Well, because we have a Gzeir Shava of Zrika, that it says both by Ola and by Bechor. Okay, so both by Ola and by Bechor it says Zrika. Ma'ola tu'uni yisod, pesach nami ton yisod. And just like the korban Ola, you have to throw the blood on a part of the Mizbeach where there's yisod. So also by the Bechor. Ve'ola guf minalan. How do we know that the korban Ola, you have to throw on a part of the Mizbeach that has yisod? So Makra el Yisod Mizbach HaOla, it says in the context of a korban chatas that you will place from the blood opposite the Yisod Mizbeach. So, and it calls it not just the regular Mizbeach, the Mizbach HaOla. So meaning it's talking about a chatas, but it says Yisod Mizbach HaOla. Why is it calling the Mizbach HaOla? Well, Alma Ola Tu'uni Yisod. That it's saying Yisod Mizbach HaOla to teach us that a korban Ola, the throwing of the blood of the Ola, needs to be on a part of the Mizbeach that has Yesod. Well, what do you think about today's daf? Cool, right? Right. So what did we discuss? So at the beginning of the daf, we were really wrapping up the previous Mishnah about the lav of Lusizbach, Al-Chametz, Tam Zivchi, that Rabbi Yehuda says that it even applies to Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim. Rabbi Shimon says it really applies to any korban that you slaughter if you have chametz around. Just that on Pesach it's limited to the korban Pesach. On Erev Pesach it's limited to the korban Pesach. During the rest of Pesach it applies to any korbanos. That if you have chametz around, you're going to be violating this lav. And then we moved on to this next Mishnah describing how the korban Pesach was actually offered in the Mizbeach, which I think was super interesting. The 3 shifts and the Kohanim in the rows, and they would pass the blood from one to the next and then throw it onto the Mizbeach. So I hope you enjoyed today's daf, and I hope you enjoy your day. Peace out.